A dream wedding turns into a nightmare. The bride discovers her husband's shocking secret. Hello, let's start another beautiful story. Welcome to my channel. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Let's go. The September breeze carried whispers through the gardens of the Harrington estate, rustling the white roses that adorned every corner of what should have been the happiest day of Anne Carter's life. Standing before the ornate full-length mirror in the bridal suite, she smoothed down the silk of her designer wedding gown, a gift from her soon-to-be husband, William Harrington III. The dress was perfect. Everything was perfect. Perhaps too perfect. 5 minutes, Miss Carter, called the wedding coordinator through the door, her voice carrying the practiced cheerfulness of someone who had orchestrated hundreds of such occasions. Anne's reflection stared back at her, green eyes questioning. When had Will last called her by her surname? She couldn't remember. From their first meeting at that charity gala 18 months ago, he had always used her first name, speaking it with a warmth that made her feel like the only woman in the world. Will had pursued her with an intensity that swept her off her feet. Expensive gifts, surprise weekends away, candle-lit dinners at exclusive restaurants. He remembered every detail she ever shared, anticipated her every need, planned every moment to perfection. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting her maid of honor, Rebecca. Instead, an older woman she didn't recognize slipped into the room. She wore a simple navy dress that seemed out of place among the luxury of the Harrington wedding, her grey hair pulled back in a severe bun. Before Anne could speak, the woman crossed the room with surprising speed. "You've made a terrible mistake," she whispered, her fingers digging into Anne's bare arm. "He's not who you think he is." Anne jerked back, her heart pounding. "Who are you? How did you get in here?" But the woman was already backing away, her eyes filled with something that looked unsettlingly like pity. "Watch for the signs. They're there if you look closely enough." With that, she slipped out as quietly as she had entered, leaving only the faint scent of lavender and fear in her wake. The wedding march began to play, its familiar notes now somehow ominous. Anne's hands trembled as she picked up her bouquet. Outside, 300 guests waited in the meticulously manicured gardens. Will waited at the altar, undoubtedly looking handsome in his custom tuxedo, that charming smile ready to greet his bride. Perfect. Everything was perfect. So why did her stomach twist with each step toward the garden? Why did the strange woman's warning echo in her mind? And why, when she caught glimpses of the guests as she prepared to make her entrance, did some of them look at her with such strange expressions? Pity, fear, knowing. The doors opened. The crowd rose. And at the end of the aisle, Will stood, waiting, his smile indeed perfect, but for the first time Anne noticed something else in his eyes as they locked with hers, something possessive, something hungry. She forced her feet to move forward, each step heavy with growing dread. The word mistake echoed in her mind with each footfall. But it was too late now. Wasn't it? 300 guests, $500,000 in preparations, and the expectations of New York's elite society pressed down on her like a physical weight. Will extended his hand as she reached the altar. His fingers were cool as they closed around hers, and his grip was just a little too tight. "You look perfect," he whispered, and Anne couldn't suppress a shiver. The ceremony passed in a blur. Anne spoke her vows on autopilot, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. When Will kissed her, his lips lingering a moment too long, she felt trapped rather than treasured. The reception that followed was a showcase of wealth and influence. Governors, CEOs, and celebrities mingled under crystal chandeliers in the Harrington Mansion's grand ballroom. and moved through it all like a ghost, accepting congratulations and forcing smiles while her mind raced. She kept scanning the crowd for the mysterious woman, but she was nowhere to be seen. Instead, she caught more of those strange looks. A server who almost dropped a tray when their eyes met, an elderly woman who crossed herself and turned away, a young socialite who whispered something to her companion while staring at Anne, with undisguised horror. As the evening wore on, Will never left her side for more than a moment. His hand remained at the small of her back, steering her through the crowd, controlling her movements with subtle pressure. Had he always been this controlling? How had she never noticed before? "Darling," Will murmured in her ear as the party began to wind down, "I have something special to show you. Meet me in my study in 10 minutes. Anne nodded, watching as he disappeared down the darkened hallway. The study. In 18 months of dating, she had never been allowed inside Will's private study. Her journalistic instincts, long dormant in the haze of whirlwind romance, began to stir. She glanced at her diamond-encrusted watch. Another perfect gift from her perfect husband. 10 minutes to make a decision. 10 minutes to choose between maintaining the facade of perfection and uncovering whatever truth lay behind that study door. The answer, she realized, had been made for her the moment that strange woman had appeared in her dressing room. She was a journalist, after all, and somewhere beneath the designer dress and carefully styled hair, that instinct for truth still burned. Anne Carter, now Anne Harrington, took a deep breath and began walking toward the study, her heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown to revelation. Behind her, the last notes of the perfect wedding reception faded away. Ahead, shadows gathered in the hallway, and somewhere in the darkness, a truth waited to shatter her perfect world forever. The hallway to Will's study seemed to stretch endlessly before Anne, each step in her wedding heels echoing against the dark mahogany floors. Family portraits lined the walls, generations of Harringtons staring down at her with eerily similar expressions, but one spot was conspicuously bare, a slightly lighter rectangle on the wallpaper marking where a frame had once hung. The study door was solid oak, imposing in its simplicity. Anne's hand trembled as she reached for the brass handle, remembering all the times Will had deflected her curiosity about this room. "Business matters, darling," he'd say, with that perfect smile. "Nothing that should worry your beautiful head." She pushed the door open. The room beyond was everything she'd expect from a wealthy man's private sanctuary. Leather-bound books, a massive desk, oriental rugs. But something felt off. The air was too sterile, as if the room were more for show than use. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Will's voice behind her made her jump. He placed his hands on her shoulders, fingers pressing just a little too hard. "I've been waiting to share this with you." "It's lovely," Anne managed, fighting to keep her voice steady, "though I imagined you'd have more personal items." "Oh, but I do." Will moved past her to the bookshelf behind his desk, his fingers traced along the spines until they reached a leather-bound copy of Great Expectations. With a soft click, the entire section of shelving swung forward. Anne's journalistic instincts blazed to life. A hidden room, of course. "After you, Mrs. Harrington." Will's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. The hidden space was smaller than the main study, but what it lacked in size it made up for in contents. One wall was covered in monitors showing security feeds from around the estate. Another held what looked like medical records and financial documents. But it was the third wall that made Anne's blood run cold. Photos, dozens of them, and in every single one was a woman who could have been Anne's twin. Catherine was beautiful, wasn't she? Will's voice had changed, losing its usual warmth. He stepped closer to the wall of photos, reaching out to touch one. "My first wife. You look so much like her. The same green eyes, the same delicate features." He turned to Anne, his expression unreadable. "The same stubborn streak." Anne's mind raced. First wife? In all their time together, Will had never mentioned being married before. She forced herself to look more closely at the photos. The woman, Catherine, was indeed startlingly similar to her. Same height, same build, same coloring, but in the later photos, something was wrong. Catherine's smile seemed strained, her eyes haunted. What happened to her? Anne's voice was barely a whisper. She had trouble understanding her role. Will's tone was matter-of-fact, as if discussing a business transaction. She couldn't appreciate everything I did for her, everything I gave her. He moved to a filing cabinet, pulling out a thick folder. The doctors at Evergreen Heights tried their best, but in the end, Anne's eyes caught on the letterhead of the documents he was showing her, Evergreen Heights Psychiatric Facility. Beneath were prescription records, therapy notes, and finally a death certificate. "This is impossible," she breathed. "I would have known. There would have been records, news stories." Will laughed, the sound chilling in its genuineness. "My dear, you of all people should know. Money can make anything disappear." He stepped closer, reaching out to touch her cheek. "But you're different. You're perfect. You'll understand." What Catherine couldn't. Anne's mind whirled with implications. The strange looks at the wedding, the mysterious woman's warning, the bare spot on the wall where Catherine's portrait must have hung. How long had Will been planning this? How many people had helped cover up what happened to his first wife? "The certificate," she managed, forcing herself to think like a journalist rather than a terrified bride. "The date. It's only 6 months before we met." "Yes." Will's smile widened. "When I saw you at that gala, I knew it was meant to be. You were exactly what I'd been looking for." A thought struck Anne with horrible clarity. The charity gala where they'd met hadn't been chance. She'd received a mysterious invitation, her name specifically requested by the organizers. At the time, it had seemed like lucky networking. Now, "You engineered our meeting," she said. "You found me first, then made sure we'd meet." "Very good." Will looked pleased, like a teacher with a star pupil. "You see, you're so much quicker than Catherine. She never figured it out until—" He trailed off, that perfect mask slipping for just a moment to reveal something dark beneath. Anne's hands were shaking as she flipped through more documents. Bank transfers to the psychiatric facility, non-disclosure agreements signed by staff, and most damning of all, a series of photos showing Catherine's decline from confident professional to hollow-eyed patient. "She's not dead, is she?" The words escaped before Anne could stop them. Will's expression changed, something dangerous, flickering in his eyes. "Now, darling, why would you think that?" But Anne had seen enough. In one of the security feeds, half hidden behind the main house, was a small cottage she'd never noticed before, and through its window she caught a glimpse of movement, a flash of long dark hair, so like her own. "You're right," Will said, softly, following her gaze to the monitor. "Catherine is very much alive, and now that you're here—" He reached past her to press a button, and Anne heard the study door lock with a definitive click. "We can all be one happy family." The wedding dress suddenly felt like a straitjacket, the diamond ring on her finger a shackle. Anne Carter, now Anne Harrington, stood in her new husband's secret room, surrounded by evidence of his obsession, and realized with crystal clarity that her perfect wedding day had been nothing but the beginning of a nightmare. The walk from Will's study to their bedroom felt like a death march. Anne's wedding dress, which had cost more than her annual salary as a journalist, now clung to her like a burial shroud. Will's hand rested on the small of her back, guiding her through the shadowed halls of what was now her prison. "You're very a quiet darling." His voice carried that same perfect tone she'd once found so charming. "Processing our little chat?" Anne forced her lips into a smile, channeling every ounce of her professional experience in maintaining composure during difficult Interviews. It's just overwhelming, all of this. The truth made the best lie. I never imagined you'd trust me with so much. Will's grip relaxed slightly. That's exactly what I love about you, Anne. You understand the importance of trust. They reached the master bedroom, and he opened the door with an elaborate gesture. Catherine never did. The bedroom was exactly as Anne had imagined during their engagement. Elegant, expensive, and utterly impersonal, like a stage set for the perfect life Will had orchestrated. She moved to the vanity, her hands shaking as she began removing her wedding jewelry. "Let me help you with that." Will stepped behind her, their eyes meeting in the mirror as his fingers worked at the clasp of her necklace. "You know, Catherine wore this same necklace on our wedding night." Anne suppressed a shudder. "It's beautiful," she managed. "Will, about Catherine?" "Yes?" His fingers stilled on her neck. "I'd like to meet her." The words tumbled out before she could stop them. "If she's going to be part of our family, as you said." Will's smile widened, but his eyes remained cold. "All in good time, darling. First, we need to make sure you're fully committed to our life together." His hands moved to the buttons of her dress. "No more questions tonight." As Will helped her undress, Anne's mind raced. The cottage she'd glimpsed in the security feed, it had to be where he was keeping Catherine. But how long had she been there? And more importantly, how had no one noticed? Then she remembered the staff's strange behavior, the averted gazes, the whispered conversations. They knew. They all knew. "What are you thinking about?" Will's voice cut through her thoughts. "The wedding," she lied smoothly. "It was perfect, everything you planned." "For you," he finished, helping her step out of the dress. "I learned so much from my mistakes with Catherine. This time, everything will be exactly right." Anne moved to the bathroom, needing a moment. Alone. Her reflection in the mirror looked ghostly, a bride on her wedding night, trembling not with anticipation, but with terror. She splashed water on her face, mind working furiously. She needed help, but who could she trust? The staff were clearly in Will's pocket. Her phone was probably monitored. She'd noticed how Will always seemed to know when she received calls or messages during their courtship. Her family? No, she couldn't risk them. Not after seeing what had happened to Catherine. Catherine! The key to everything lay in that cottage. If Anne could just find a way to reach her. "Anne?" Will's voice carried through the door. "Don't be too long, darling. The night is still young. Just freshening up," she called back, her voice steadier than she felt. As she prepared to face her new husband, Anne began constructing a plan. She'd play the perfect wife, docile, loving, understanding. She'd earn Will's trust, learn his routines, find the gaps in his surveillance, and somehow she'd find a way to reach Catherine. The bathroom door opened, and Anne stepped out wearing the silk nightgown Will had chosen for her. His eyes raked over her possessively. "Perfect," he murmured, reaching for her. "Absolutely perfect." Anne went into his arms, her body on autopilot, while her mind continued plotting. She was a journalist. She knew how to investigate, how to piece together stories, how to find the truth. Now she just had to do it while playing the role of her life. As Will's lips met hers, she kissed him back with well-practiced passion, all while memorizing every detail of the room, noting potential weapons, escape routes, anything that might help her survive. The champagne on the nightstand. Could she drug it? The heavy crystal lamp. Could it become a weapon? The balcony. How far was the drop? "You're trembling," Will observed, pulling back to study her face. "Just nervous," Anne whispered, letting him see the fear in her eyes, but not its true cause. "Everything's happening so fast." Will's expression softened with practiced concern. "We have all the time in the world, darling." His fingers traced her cheek. Forever, in fact. The word forever echoed in Anne's mind as Will led her to the bed. Forever in this golden cage. unless she found a way out, forever watching her. Every word, her every move, forever knowing that somewhere on the grounds another woman, another version of herself, was living that same nightmare. As the night deepened and Will finally drifted to sleep beside her, Anne lay awake, staring at the ceiling. In the distance, she could just make out the silhouette of the cottage through the bedroom window. Somewhere in that little building, Catherine was probably lying awake too, perhaps watching this very window, remembering her own first night as Mrs. Harrington. Anne closed her eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, her mind kept returning to the mysterious woman from the wedding, the one who had tried to warn her. Who was she? And more importantly, could she be the ally Anne so desperately needed? Morning light crept through the mansion's windows, casting long shadows across the imported marble floors. Anne stood in front of her new closet, staring at rows of carefully curated clothing, all in her size, all in style she would have chosen herself. Will had thought of everything. "The blue dress would look lovely on you." Will's voice came from the doorway, making her jump. He was already dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, his smile as practiced as ever. Catherine always looked stunning in blue. Anne's fingers trembled as she reached for the dress he'd indicated. "Thank you. I was just thinking the same thing." Another lie, another performance. "Will you be going to the office today?" "Actually, I thought we could spend the day together. Get you acclimated to your new home." He stepped closer, adjusting. Her pearl necklace, another wedding gift. "There are some rules we should discuss." Rules. Of course there would be rules. Over breakfast in the sunny conservatory, Will laid them out with the same precision he used in his business dealings. "Your cell phone will need to be upgraded to our secure family plan," he began, buttering his toast. "For your safety, of course. The staff will handle your social media accounts. We have a wonderful PR team that manages the family's public image." "My work," Anne started, but Will cut her off with a gentle smile. "Darling, you won't need to work anymore. The Harrington name comes with certain responsibilities. Charity boards, social events, family obligations." His tone left no room for argument. "Besides, investigative journalism can be so dangerous." Anne took a sip of coffee to hide her expression. Her job at the Daily Chronicle had been her life before Will. Now she understood why he'd been so insistent that she'd take an extended leave after the wedding. "The grounds are yours to explore," Will continued, "though I'd prefer you stay within. The main gardens, the outer areas can be quite treacherous. And of course some areas are private. My study, the security office, the guest cottage." "The cottage." Anne's heart raced. "Is that where Catherine—" "Let's not discuss Catherine right now." Will's voice hardened for just a moment before, returning to its usual smoothness. "Now, about your schedule. Mrs. Reynolds, our head of household, will review each day's itinerary with you every morning. She'll help you adjust to your new responsibilities." As if on cue, Mrs. Reynolds appeared, a stern-faced woman in her 60s, who Anne recognized as one of the staff members who'd avoided eye contact during the wedding. "Shall we begin the house tour, Mrs. Harrington?" The next 2 hours were a blur of rooms and rules disguised as helpful suggestions. The kitchen was staffed around the clock, but Mrs. Harrington never needs to concern herself with meal preparation. The security team maintained a constant presence, but it's for the family's protection in these uncertain times. The gardens were beautiful, but certain areas are under renovation and best avoided. Every room had cameras, every door had electronic locks, every window was equipped with state-of-the-art security features that Mrs. Reynolds demonstrated with practiced efficiency. "Your new office is through here," Mrs. Reynolds said, opening a door to reveal a beautifully appointed sitting room. "Mr. Harrington thought you might enjoy having a space for your correspondence." The room was lovely, with views of the garden and elegant furnishings, but Anne's trained eye caught the details. The computer was clearly monitored. The phone was a closed-circuit internal line, and the single window, despite its size, didn't open. "Mrs. Reynolds," Anne ventured, keeping her voice casual, "how long have you worked for the Harringtons?" The older woman stiffened slightly. 27 years, Mrs. Harrington." "So you knew Catherine?" Mrs. Reynolds' face remained impassive, but her hands clutched her clipboard tighter. "We don't discuss former staff or family members without Mr. Harrington's permission. House rules." She turned briskly. "Shall we continue to the conservatory?" As they walked, Anne noticed more signs of the mansion's true nature. The art pieces mounted just a little too high, concealing cameras. The staff moving in practiced patterns like guards on patrol. The gardens visible through every window, beautiful but bordered by high walls covered in flowering vines that couldn't quite hide the security sensors. "Your afternoon schedule has been arranged," Mrs. Reynolds continued, consulting her ever-present clipboard. "Tea with the garden club board at 2. They're eager to welcome you as their new chairwoman. Then dress fittings at 4. Mr. Harrington has ordered a complete wardrobe suitable for your new position." "And what exactly is my new position?" Anne asked, unable to keep a hint of bite from her voice. Mrs. Reynolds looked at her directly, for the first time. "You are Mrs. William Harrington III. That is position enough." There was something in her eyes, pity, warning, before she looked away again. "The blue room still needs to be reviewed. This way, please." By late afternoon, Anne's head was spinning with rules and restrictions, all presented as privileges and protections. Every attempt to gather information had been deflected. Every casual question about Catherine had been met with polite but firm resistance. Will found her in her office as the sun began to set, wrapped in his perfect facade of concern. "How was your first day, darling? Not too overwhelming, I hope." Anne forced a smile. "Everyone has been so helpful, especially Mrs. Reynolds." "Good, good." Will perched on the edge of her desk. "I've been thinking about what you said last night, about meeting Catherine." He paused, studying her reaction. "Perhaps soon, once you've settled in, once I'm sure you understand your place here." Anne's heart leaped, even as her skin crawled at his words. A chance to meet Catherine, to help her, to find a way out for both of them. But first, she had to play her part perfectly. "Whatever you think is best," she said softly, reaching for his hand. "Everything you've done, it's all so perfect." Will's smile widened as he squeezed her hand just a little too tight. "That's my girl. You see, I knew you'd understand, not like—" He caught himself. "Well, the past is the past. Now shall we dress for dinner? We're dining in tonight, just the two of us, so we can discuss your new role in more detail." As Will led her from the room, Anne caught a glimpse of their reflection in a decorative mirror, the perfect couple, the perfect life. But in the glass, she could see what looked like a shadow moving behind them, just out of focus. When she turned to look, there was nothing there. But she knew, somewhere in this golden cage, Catherine was watching, waiting, and somehow Anne had to find a way to reach her before she became just another ghost in the Harrington mansion's mirrors. 3 days into her marriage, Anne discovered the first real clue about Catherine's past in the unlikeliest of places, a charity auction catalogue from 2 years ago. She was in her office, dutifully reviewing the social obligations Mrs. Reynolds had laid out, when a familiar face caught her eye. There, in a grainy photo of a hospital fundraiser, stood Catherine Harrington. She was wearing the same pearl necklace that now adorned Anne's throat, but it was her expression that made Anne's breath catch. Catherine was looking not at the camera, but slightly to the side, her face frozen in what Anne now recognized as barely concealed fear. And there, in the background, barely visible but unmistakable, was the mysterious woman from Anne's wedding. Finding anything interesting? Anne managed not to jump at Will's voice. She was getting better at that. Just familiarizing myself with our social circle, she replied, smoothly turning the page before he could see what had caught her attention. The hospital seems like a worthy cause. Ah, yes, the children's wing. Will moved behind her chair, his hands resting on her shoulders. One of Catherine's pet projects, actually. Before she became difficult, Anne kept her voice carefully neutral. What kind of work did she do there? Now, darling, we discuss this. His fingers tightened slightly. The past is the past. Though, he paused thoughtfully. Your interest in charity work is commendable. Perhaps we could host a fundraiser here, show everyone how well you're settling into your role. A fundraiser. People in the house. Potential allies or witnesses. That's a wonderful idea, Anne said, genuine enthusiasm creeping into her voice. I'd love to help organize it. I'll have Mrs. Reynolds start the arrangements. Will kissed the top of her head. But remember, you're still adjusting. No need to overwhelm yourself. The moment Will left, Anne returned to the catalogue. The mysterious woman was wearing a hospital volunteer badge, but the image was too blurred to make out a name. Still, it was a connection. Proof that someone out there knew the truth about Catherine. Later that afternoon, while Mrs. Reynolds was distracted by a phone call, Anne managed to slip into the mansion's library. The room was massive, filled with first editions and leather-bound volumes that probably hadn't been touched in years. But Anne wasn't interested in the books. Her eye had caught something else, a stack of old newspapers, carefully preserved. Working quickly, she began scanning headlines. Most were about the Harrington family's business successes or charitable works. But then she found it, a small article from 3 years ago. Local philanthropist backs revolutionary mental health program at City Hospital. The article described a new wing at Evergreen Heights, funded by William Harrington III. The same facility mentioned in the documents she'd seen in Will's study. The piece quoted Will extensively about his passion for mental health treatment, sparked by personal experience with family illness. Anne's hands shook as she took photos of the article with her phone, her new monitored phone. She'd have to delete them soon, but not before memorizing every detail. Mrs. Harrington, Mrs. Reynolds's voice carried from the hallway. Your dress fitting is in 5 minutes. Another fitting, another beautiful cage to try on. Coming! Anne, in cold, quickly returning the papers to their exact position. That evening, during another elaborate dinner for two, Anne decided to take a risk. I've been thinking about the fundraiser, she began carefully. The new mental health wing at Evergreen Heights might be a good cause to support. Will's fork paused halfway to his mouth. What made you think of that? I saw some old press coverage in the library. It seemed like something you were passionate about. For a long moment, Will studied her face. Then his perfect smile returned. You're absolutely right. Mental health is close to my heart. The things I've seen, the people I've tried to help. He reached for her hand. Sometimes people just can't be saved from themselves, no matter how much you love them. The threat was clear beneath his words. Anne squeezed his hand, playing her part. I understand. You only want to help people. Exactly. Will's smile widened. I'm so glad you understand, darling. Catherine never did. She fought the treatments, refused to accept help, but you're different. Later that night, Anne lay awake in their bed, listening to Will's steady breathing beside her. Her mind raced with the day's discoveries. The hospital connection, the mysterious woman, the treatments Catherine had supposedly refused. A sound from outside caught her attention. Movement in the garden. Anne slipped from bed and moved to the window. There, in the moonlight, she saw a figure hurrying along the path toward the cottage. Not Catherine, one of the staff, carrying what looked like a medical bag. So Catherine was being treated or drugged. Either way, it was proof she was alive. Proof that something was happening in that cottage. But how to reach her? The grounds were watched day and night. The staff were all in Will's pocket. The phones were monitored, the computers tracked. The fundraiser, Anne realized, might be her only chance. A house full of outsiders, everyone distracted. If she could just find that mysterious woman from the hospital, get a message to her somehow. A floorboard creaked behind her. Trouble. Sleeping, darling? Anne turned to find Will watching her, his expression unreadable in the darkness. Just restless. Wedding excitement, I suppose. Come back to bed. His voice was gentle, but it wasn't a request. Tomorrow's a busy day. Mrs. Reynolds has your whole schedule planned. As Anne followed Will back to bed, her mind was already working on the next step of her investigation. The fundraiser would take weeks to plan. Until then, she had to keep playing the perfect wife while gathering every scrap of information she could find. Somewhere in this mansion's past was the key to Catherine's fate. And somewhere in this mansion's present was Catherine herself, perhaps lying awake right now, watching the same moonlight and remembering when she too had been the perfect Mrs. Harrington. Planning a charity fundraiser, Anne discovered, was the perfect cover for asking questions. Every detail required decisions. Every decision required research, and research meant access to information. Will, pleased by her apparent embrace of her new role, had given her limited access to the house's records, all carefully curated, of course, but even sanitized histories had their tells. The guest list from the last major event would be helpful, Anne told Mrs. Reynolds one morning, surrounded by sample invitations in her office. For comparison? The housekeeper hesitated. That would have been the Morrison wedding 2 years ago. No, Anne said carefully. I meant the last Harrington event, the hospital fundraiser, perhaps. Mrs. Reynolds' hand stilled on her ever-present clipboard. Those records were archived, but I can help you build a new list. Mr. Harrington has very specific preferences about guests. Of course he did. Anne had noticed how the proposed guest list was heavy on elderly couples and business associates, people unlikely to ask uncomfortable questions about the previous Mrs. Harrington. Speaking of preferences, Anne ventured, the menu selections, a crash from the hallway interrupted her. Both women turned to see a young maid, Lucy, frantically picking up pieces of a broken vase. The girl's hands were shaking. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Harrington. I was just cleaning and... It's fine, Lucy. Anne moved to help, but Mrs. Reynolds stepped between them. That won't be necessary, Mrs. Harrington. Lucy, report to the kitchen. We'll discuss this later. Something in Mrs. Reynolds' tone made Anne's skin crawl. As Lucy hurried away, Anne caught a glimpse of her face, tear-stained and terrified, not the expression of someone merely afraid of losing their job. Later that afternoon, Anne managed to orchestrate a seemingly chance encounter with Lucy in the East Wing corridor, away from the most obvious cameras. Mrs. Harrington! Lucy nearly dropped her cleaning supplies. I'm not supposed to... It's all right, Anne said softly. I just wanted to make sure you were okay. About the vase. Lucy's eyes darted around the corridor. Please, I can't... They'll know if I... She stopped abruptly, pressing her lips together. Who will know? But Lucy was already backing away. I'm sorry about the vase. It won't happen again. Please don't tell Mr. Harrington I was cleaning this wing. I'm not supposed to be here when... When what? Anne wanted to ask, but Lucy practically ran down the hallway, leaving her questions unanswered. The East Wing. Anne had noticed how the staff seemed to avoid it during certain hours. Now, watching Lucy's retreat, she made a mental note of the time. 3:47 p.m. Back in her office, Anne pulled up the mansion's maintenance schedule on her monitored computer. The East Wing was marked for cleaning between 9 a.m. and 2 p.m. daily. So why had Lucy been there at nearly 4? A notification popped up on her screen, a message from Will. "Looking forward to dinner, darling. Wear the blue dress." The blue dress. Always the blue dress. Anne was beginning to hate the colour, but she smiled as she typed her reply. "Of course, darling. Can't wait." She had just finished changing when Will arrived home, exactly on schedule. His smile faltered slightly, seeing her at her vanity. "Different perfume today?" Anne's heart skipped. She'd been so careful about maintaining every detail of her appearance. Just testing samples for the fundraiser. The event planner suggested, "No." Will's voice was sharp. "The jasmine suits you better. Catherine's perfume." Always Catherine. Every preference, every detail of Anne's appearance and behavior, all shaped to match a woman supposedly dead, but actually imprisoned somewhere on the grounds. "Of course," Anne said smoothly, reaching for the familiar jasmine bottle. "I don't know what I was thinking." Will's smile returned. "I have a surprise for you at dinner, a gift to show my appreciation for all your hard work on the fundraiser." The gift turned out to be a diamond bracelet, elegant, expensive, and equipped with what Will called a safety feature. "It monitors your vital signs," he explained, fastening it around her wrist. "Heart rate, location, everything. For your protection, of course. The grounds can be dangerous at night." A tracking device. Anne forced a delighted smile. "It's beautiful. You think of everything." "I learned from my mistakes with Catherine." Will sipped his wine. "She never appreciated these precautions. Kept trying to wander off." "What happened when she wandered?" Will's expression darkened for just a moment. "The grounds can be dangerous, as I said, especially the old well near the cottage. That's why we had to protect her from herself." After dinner, Anne stood at their bedroom window, absently rubbing her wrist beneath the new bracelet. From this angle, she could just make out movement near the cottage, the nightly medical visit she'd observed before. But tonight, something was different. The figure wasn't moving toward the cottage, but away from it, taking a path that led to the east wing. Suddenly, Lucy's presence in the corridor made sense. She hadn't been cleaning. She'd been watching, reporting. The pieces were starting to come together. Catherine in the cottage. Medical visits, staff monitoring specific areas at specific times, the tracking bracelet, all part of Will's elaborate system of control, a system Anne was now irrevocably part of. Her wrist beeped softly, the bracelet monitoring her elevated heart rate. Moments later, Will's voice came from the doorway. "Everything all right, darling? You seem agitated." Anne turned, the perfect wife's smile firmly in place. "Just excited about the fundraiser. So many details to consider." "That's my girl." Will's answering smile didn't reach his eyes. "Always thinking ahead, but don't work too hard. We wouldn't want you getting overwhelmed." Like Catherine, the threat hung unspoken between them. Like Catherine, who had tried to escape. Like Catherine, who now lived in a cottage under constant surveillance. As Will led her to bed, Anne's mind was racing. The fundraiser was 3 weeks away. 3 weeks to perfect her plan. 3 weeks to figure out what happened in the East Wing. 3 weeks to save herself from becoming just another Mrs. Harrington, trapped behind perfect smiles and diamond-studded tracking devices. The garden party was Will's idea, a small preview gathering for potential donors before the main fundraiser. "Just 30 of our closest friends," he'd said, his perfect smile firmly in place. "A chance to show everyone how wonderfully you're settling in." Anne stood among the roses, playing hostess in another blue dress, her tracking bracelet glinting. In the afternoon sun, the guests were exactly who she'd expected. Elderly philanthropists, business associates, all carefully chosen. All safe. Then she saw her. The woman stood at the edge of the crowd, half hidden behind a topiary. She wore a conservative navy dress and sensible shoes. easily overlooked among the designer outfits. But Anne recognized her instantly from the hospital photograph, the woman who had tried to warn her at the wedding. Their eyes met across the garden. The woman gave an almost imperceptible nod toward the maze, the one part of the grounds where the security cameras had blind spots, thanks to the high hedges. "Darling," Will's hand settled on Anne's lower back, "you seem distracted. Just making sure everyone has drinks." Anne forced herself to lean into his touch. "Actually, I should check with the staff about the champagne supply." Will's fingers tightened slightly. "Mrs. Reynolds can handle that. I want to be thorough." Anne turned to face him, playing her role perfectly. "Everything has to be perfect, just like you taught me." His smile widened at that. "That's my girl. Don't be too long." Anne made a show of speaking to several servants, gradually working her way toward the maze. The woman had disappeared, but Anne knew where she'd be. The maze had been part of the original estate, its hedges now 12 feet high. Anne had memorized its layout during her innocent morning walks. 3 left turns, then right, then straight. To the center, the woman was waiting by the stone bench, her posture tense. "We don't have much time. The cameras might not see us, but they'll notice if you're gone too long." "Who are you?" Anne kept her voice low. "How did you know about—" "My name's Helen. I was Catherine's nurse at Evergreen Heights." The woman's eyes darted around the maze. "And if you're not careful, you'll end up there too. Catherine's alive. I saw her in the cottage." "Not here." Helen pressed a small object into Anne's hand. "Bathroom cabinet, guest powder room, behind the panel with the loose screw. I've been leaving them for months, hoping you'd find one." Anne glanced down. It was a note written on hospital stationery, folded impossibly small. "Read it somewhere safe, then burn it, and whatever you do, don't—" "Mrs. Harrington." Mrs. Reynolds' voice carried over the hedges. "Mr. Harrington is asking for you." Helen stepped back. "The blue pills. Watch for the blue pills." Then she was gone, disappearing down another path as Mrs. Reynolds rounded the corner. "There you are." The housekeeper's face betrayed nothing. "Your guests are missing you." Back at the party, Will was deep in conversation with the silver-haired couple. His smile remained perfect, but Anne caught the tension in his shoulders as she approached. "Ah, there's my wandering wife." His arm snaked around her waist. "The Andersons were just telling me about their new mental health initiative. Fascinating work they're doing with experimental treatments." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of forced smiles and careful conversations. The note burned in Anne's pocket like a live coal. Finally, as the last guests departed, she excused herself to freshen up. The guest powder room was rarely used, too far from the main areas. Anne's hands shook as she located the loose panel, finding more folded notes hidden behind it. 5 total, each on the same hospital stationery. She read them quickly, her heart pounding. Catherine tried to expose the program. That's why she's here. The treatments aren't treatments, they're experiments. Check the East Wing, 3rd floor, room 317. Blue pills, compliance. White pills, forgetting. He's done this before. Catherine wasn't the first. The sound of footsteps sent Anne scrambling to hide the notes, but she needn't have worried. It was just Lucy, cleaning supplies in hand. Their eyes met in the mirror. Lucy's gaze dropped to Anne's hand, where one note was still visible. "The blue pills," Lucy whispered. "They started giving them to me too after I saw—" She stopped, terror crossing her face. "I'm not supposed to be here. Please, I never saw you." She fled, leaving Anne alone with the devastating implications of her words. The staff weren't just complicit. They were being drugged into compliance. Anne burned the notes in the bathroom sink, watching the evidence dissolve into ash. But the words remained burned in her memory. Catherine had discovered something at the hospital, something about experiments, something Will had gone to great lengths to cover up. And now Anne had proof, but proof was dangerous. Catherine had proof too, and look where she'd ended up. That night, as she prepared for bed, Anne noticed something different about her evening tea. The colour was slightly off. "New blend," Will said, watching her with those calculating eyes. "The doctor suggested it might help you sleep. You seemed so agitated at the party today." Anne lifted the cup, remembering Helen's warning. The liquid was faintly blue. "Actually, I'm not very thirsty." She set the cup down, "just tired from all the excitement." "Drink your tea, darling." Will's voice was soft, but his eyes were hard. "Doctor's orders." As Anne raised the cup to her lips, she knew she was at a crossroads. The blue pills led to compliance, to becoming another Catherine, trapped and controlled. But refusing them would reveal her hand, and she wasn't ready for that. Not yet, not until she knew what was in room 317. So she drank, tasting the bitter medicine beneath the chamomile, watching Will's satisfied smile. And she began to plan. The blue pills made everything hazy. Anne found herself losing chunks of time, drifting through her days in a fog of artificial calm. But underneath, in the part of her mind she fought to keep clear, she was watching, waiting, learning the patterns of her gilded prison. The East Wing's third floor was accessed by a service elevator, supposedly out of order according to the sign that had been there since her arrival. But Anne had noticed the staff using it during specific hours, always when they thought no one was watching. "Your medication, Mrs. Harrington?" Mrs. Reynolds appeared with the evening tea tray, right on schedule. Anne took the cup, pretending to sip as she had been for the past 3 days. The trick was to hold the liquid in her mouth until she could discreetly spit it into one of the many potted plants Will kept in their bedroom. A risky game, but it was working. Her mind was gradually clearing. "The fundraiser preparations are coming along nicely," Mrs. Reynolds continued, watching Anne with those knowing eyes. "Though you seem tired lately. Perhaps you should rest more." "Actually, I'm feeling quite energetic." Anne set down the cup, making sure it was empty. "Will mentioned wanting to expand the hospital program. I thought I might review some of the old files tomorrow, get a better understanding of the Foundation's history." Something flickered across Mrs. Reynolds' face. "I'll have those brought to your office. The appropriate ones, of course." "Of course. The sanitized version, carefully curated to hide whatever dark truth lay in room 317. That night, Anne lay awake beside Will, listening to his breathing deepen into sleep. The tracking bracelet felt heavy on her wrist, its soft, blinking light a constant reminder of her captivity. But she had discovered something about it. The signal weakened in certain parts of the house, particularly near the service elevator. At exactly 2:47 a.m., Anne slipped out of bed. The night staff would be changing shifts, creating a brief window when the East Wing was less closely watched. She had timed it during her sleepwalking episodes, another convenient side effect of the medication she was supposedly taking. The service elevator required a key card, but Anne had been practicing with the one she'd lifted from Lucy's cleaning. Supplies. The girl was so terrified now that she hardly noticed when things went missing. The elevator was old, its mechanisms quieter than the main ones. Anne held her breath as it creaked upward, watching the tracking bracelet signal grow. Weaker with each floor. On the 3rd floor, it finally went dark. The hallway was dimly lit, the air heavy with disuse. Room 3117 was at the end, its door unmarked except for a small keypad lock. Anne's fingers shook as she punched in the code she'd memorized from watching the medical staff. 3178294. The lock clicked open. Inside, banks of filing cabinets lined the walls. But these weren't the pristine, organized files from Will's study. These were old, stuffed with handwritten notes and photographs. And they went back years before Catherine. Patient exhibits increased compliance after third treatment cycle. Subject shows promising response to memory suppression. Unfortunate incident with test subject 23. Recommend increased dosage. Anne's hands trembled as she photographed page after page with her backup phone, the burner she'd managed to buy through a carefully orchestrated series of exchanges with the catering staff. The evidence was horrifying. Will hadn't just imprisoned Catherine. He'd been experimenting on women for years, using the hospital program as cover. A sound in the hallway made her freeze. Footsteps approaching slowly. Anne quickly replaced the files, her heart pounding. The footsteps stopped outside. The door. A shadow appeared beneath it. The doorknob turned. Anne pressed herself against the wall behind the door as it opened. A figure entered, one of the medical staff she'd seen visiting the cottage. The woman went straight to the filing cabinets, pulling out a folder labeled Current Protocol. In the dim light, Anne could just make out the contents, photographs of herself taken without her knowledge, notes about her treatment progress, observations about her supposed symptoms. They were already building her file. The woman added some papers to the folder, then left, closing the door behind her. Anne waited until the footsteps faded before, letting out the breath she'd been holding. She had to get out, now. But as she reached for the door, something caught her eye. A small box had fallen from the folder, spilling its contents. Inside were more photographs, older ones. Women who had come before Catherine. Women who shared an eerie resemblance to both Catherine and Anne, and among them a familiar face, Helen, not as a nurse, but as a patient. The pieces clicked into place. Helen hadn't been Catherine's nurse. She had been another experiment, another Mrs. Harrington who had somehow escaped, and now she was trying to save Anne from the same fate. A sudden wave of dizziness hit her, the lingering effects of the blue pills she hadn't fully avoided. Anne steadied herself against the wall, fighting to stay focused. She had to get back to her room before Will noticed her absence. The return journey was a blur of careful movements and held breath. By the time she slipped back into bed, her heart was racing so fast she was sure the tracking bracelet would give her away. But Will slept on, unaware that his perfect wife had just discovered the truth about his hospital program. Anne lay in the darkness, her mind racing despite the fog of medication. Helen had escaped. There was a way out. But first, she had to find Catherine. And to do that, she needed to get into the cottage. The fundraiser was in 10 days. 10 days to plan. 10 days to gather allies. 10 days to figure out how Helen had broken free. Will stirred beside her, his hand reaching for her in his sleep. Anne forced herself to stay still as his fingers brushed her neck, right where the pulse betrayed her fear. "My perfect wife," he murmured, still half asleep. Anne stared at the ceiling, thinking of the photographs in room 317, of all the perfect wives who had come before, of Catherine waiting in her cottage prison, and of Helen, who had found a way to shatter the perfect lie. The fundraiser invitations had gone out, each envelope sealed with the Harrington family crest. Anne sat at her desk, reviewing the RSVP list, while her mind raced with the real preparations, the ones that had nothing to do with table settings or flower arrangements. "More tea, Mrs. Harrington?" Mrs. Reynolds appeared with the familiar silver tray. "Thank you." Anne took the cup, noting the telltale blue tint. Her sleeve brushed against a stack of papers, knocking them to the floor. As Mrs. Reynolds bent to help gather them, Anne quickly emptied the cup into the nearby orchid pot. The housekeeper's eyes narrowed slightly. Had she noticed? Anne couldn't be sure anymore. The line between allies and enemies had become increasingly blurred since her discovery in room 317. A note from Helen had arrived that morning, hidden in the latest flower delivery for the fundraiser. "Garden Club meeting tomorrow, 2 p.m. The Garden Club had become their cover for communication. Helen, playing her role as a hospital volunteer and socialite, had managed to get herself invited to several planning committees. Each meeting was a careful dance of coded conversations and hidden messages. Mrs. Harrison was asking about the seating arrangements, Mrs. Reynolds said, gathering the tea things. She's quite insistent on being at the main table. Anne recognized the warning in her tone. Mrs. Harrison, Helen's current alias, was being watched. "We'll have to be diplomatic," Anne replied carefully. "Perhaps near the garden doors." She mentioned enjoying the view. Mrs. Reynolds' expression didn't change, but Anne caught the slight nod. Message received. The next day's garden club meeting was held in the conservatory, where the humidity interfered with the audio surveillance. Anne moved among the ladies, playing the perfect hostess, while watching Helen carefully arrange some roses near the far window. "The white ones are lovely," Anne commented, pausing beside her, "though they need careful handling. The thorns, you know." "Yes," Helen replied softly. "I learned that lesson the hard way. Twice." Twice. She had tried to escape twice before succeeding. Anne's heart raced as Helen continued her work, speaking in barely audible whispers between movements. "The cottage, northern wall, loose brick behind the ivy." Anne adjusted a nearby orchid. "Guards, rotation changes at midnight, 3-minute gap." "Catherine?" Helen's hands stilled for just a moment. "Heavily drugged, but aware. She's been fighting the blue pills longer than any of us." Us. The word hung between them, heavy with meaning. How many had there been? How many perfect wives had Will collected and controlled? "The fundraiser," Helen continued. "It's your best chance, but you'll need—" "Anne, darling." Will's voice cut through the conservatory like a knife. Both women straightened immediately. He stood in the doorway, immaculate as always. But Anne caught the tension in his stance. How long had he been watching? "I thought I'd surprise you with lunch." His smile was perfect, predatory. "Mrs. Harrison, isn't it? From the hospital board?" "Yes, Mr. Harrington." Helen's voice was steady, her socialite mask firmly in place. "I was just admiring your wife's excellent taste in flowers." "Anne has excellent taste in everything." Will's hand settled on the small of Anne's back. "She's perfect in every way." The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze of tension. Will stayed close, watching every interaction, every movement. When he finally left for a business call, Anne nearly collapsed from the strain of maintaining her facade. That evening, as she prepared for bed, she found a new note tucked into her jewelry box. "He knows. Move faster." But moving faster meant taking bigger risks. The fundraiser was in 3 days. The guest list had grown to over 200 people, each one a potential witness or a potential obstacle. Anne stared at her reflection as she got ready for bed. The woman in the mirror looked perfect, polished. Only the eyes gave away the truth, burning with determination and fear. "You seem quiet tonight," Will observed, appearing behind her in the mirror. "Tired from all the planning?" "Just nervous about the fundraiser." Another careful lie. "I want everything to be perfect." "It will be." His hands settled on her shoulders, possessive. "You know how much I appreciate perfection." Later, lying beside him in the darkness, Anne's mind raced with plans and contingencies. The loose brick Helen had mentioned, the guard rotation schedule, the 3-minute window at midnight, but most importantly, Catherine. Would she be strong enough to move? Would she even trust them after so long under Will's control? The tracking bracelet felt like it was tightening around Anne's wrist, its steady pulse matching the countdown in her head. 3 days until the fundraiser. 3 days to finalize their escape plan. 3 days to save Catherine and herself from becoming just. Another file in room 317. Through the window, she could see the cottage, dark and silent in the moonlight. Somewhere inside, Catherine was waiting, fighting against the blue pills, holding on to whatever scraps of herself remained. Soon, Anne thought, soon they would both be free. Unless Will's watchful eyes and perfect smile hid one more secret, one that could destroy everything before it even began. The day before the fundraiser, everything began to fall apart. It started with Lucy. Anne found her in the East Wing corridor, crumpled against the wall, her eyes glazed and unfocused. The cleaning supplies lay scattered around her. A bottle of blue pills spilled across the marble floor. "They know," Lucy whispered as Anne helped her up. "They know I helped you into room 317. Anne's blood ran cold. "What did you tell them?" "Nothing yet." Lucy's fingers dug into Anne's arm. "But the new pills, they're stronger. I can't keep fighting them." Before Anne could respond, footsteps echoed down the hallway. She quickly staged the scene to look like a simple fall, stepping back just as Mrs. Reynolds rounded the corner. "Another accident, Lucy?" The housekeeper's voice was cold. "Perhaps you need some time off to rest." The threat was clear. Lucy would disappear, just like the others Anne had read about in room 317's files. "Actually," Anne cut in smoothly, "I was hoping Lucy could help with the final fundraiser preparations. She has such an eye for detail." Mrs. Reynolds' expression didn't change, but Anne caught the calculating look in her eyes. "As you wish, Mrs. Harrington, though I'm sure your husband will have concerns about such unstable staff at such an important event." The rest of the day passed in a blur of last-minute arrangements and mounting dread. Anne moved through it all like a perfectly programmed automaton, checking table settings and approving flower arrangements while her mind raced. If they knew about Lucy helping her into room 317, what else did they know? Had they discovered her communication with Helen? The notes? The plans? Her questions were answered that evening when Will called her into his study, the public one, not the hidden room where she'd first discovered the truth about Catherine. "Darling," he began, his voice carrying that dangerous gentleness she'd come to fear. "I'm concerned about your newest friend, Mrs. Harrison." Anne kept her expression neutral. "From the hospital board. She's been incredibly helpful with the fundraiser planning." "Has she?" Will pressed a button on his desk, and a security feed appeared on the wall screen. It showed Anne and Helen in the conservatory arranging flowers. Their lips were moving, but the audio was garbled by the humidity, or so Anne had thought. Will pressed another button, and suddenly their whispered conversation became clear. "Ut loose brick behind the ivy." New microphones they'd installed. New microphones that could cut through the humidity. "I've always admired your investigative instincts," Will continued, standing to move behind her chair. "It's what drew me to you initially. Your passion for uncovering the truth." His hands settled on her shoulders too tight. "But sometimes, darling, the truth can be unhealthy." Anne forced herself to lean back into his touch. "I don't understand. Helen was just helping with the arrangements." "Oh, Anne." Will's fingers moved to her throat, resting on her pulse. "Let's not play games. We both know who Helen really is, what she was, what she did." "Was?" Anne's heart stopped. "There was an unfortunate accident this afternoon. A car crash on the way to the hospital. Very tragic." Will's voice carried mock sympathy. "The funeral will be after the fundraiser. Of course. We wouldn't want to disappoint our guests." The room spun. Helen was dead. Their plans, their careful preparations, all destroyed with surgical precision. "Now," Will continued, moving to face her, "we need to discuss your medication schedule. The doctor thinks we should increase the dosage, for your own good, of course." "Of course," Anne heard herself say, her perfect wife mask still somehow in place despite the screaming in her head. "And one more thing." Will's smile turned cruel. I think it's time you paid Catherine a visit. Tonight. She's been asking for you. It was a trap. It had to be. But as Will led her from the study, Anne realized she had no choice. The carefully orchestrated escape plan was in ruins. Helen was dead. Lucy was being drugged into submission. Whatever happened next would have to be improvised. "Wear the blue dress," Will called after her. "You know how I love you in blue." In their bedroom, Anne stood before the mirror, methodically, applying her makeup while her mind raced through possibilities. The fundraiser was tomorrow, 200 guests, maximum security. And now Will knew about her investigation, about Helen, about everything. Or did he? He knew about room 317, about the conservatory conversations, but did he know about the burner phone, about the evidence she'd photographed, about the other set of plans, the ones Helen had helped her create as a backup? The tracking bracelet beeped softly, reminding her of her captivity, but as she stared at her reflection, at the perfect mask she'd learned to wear, Anne realized something. Will's perfect system had one fatal flaw. He was so convinced of his own infallibility, so certain of his control, that he couldn't imagine anyone truly outmaneuvering him. He thought showing her his hand would break her. Instead, it had shown her his weaknesses. "Ready, darling?" Will appeared in the doorway, immaculate as always. "Catherine's waiting," and smoothed down her blue dress and turned to him with a perfect smile. "Yes, I think it's time Catherine and I finally met." Behind her smile, behind the fear and grief for Helen, a new plan was forming. Because Will had forgotten the most important thing about his perfect wife. She had learned from the best how to hide her true intentions behind a flawless facade. The cottage path seemed longer in darkness. Anne walked between Will and Mrs. Reynolds, her heels sinking slightly into the damp earth. Above them, security cameras tracked their movement, their red lights blinking like cruel stars. "Remember, darling," Will's voice carried that false concern she'd grown to hate. "Catherine can be confused. The treatments affect everyone differently." The cottage door opened before they reached it, revealing a nurse Anne recognized from the east wing. Inside, the space was clinically clean despite its cozy furnishings. Everything carefully staged, just like the rest of Will's perfect world. "She's in the sitting room," the nurse said. "We've adjusted her medication for the visit." Anne's heart pounded as they entered the room. And there she was, Catherine Harrington, sitting in a wing-back chair, wearing a blue dress that matched Anne's exactly. The resemblance was uncanny. Same dark hair, same green eyes, same delicate features. But where Anne was still perfectly groomed, Catherine showed the effects of her captivity. Her hands trembled slightly, and her eyes held a glazed quality that spoke of heavy medication. "Catherine," Will's voice was gentle, practiced. "Look who's come to visit. Isn't this nice?" Catherine's eyes focused on Anne, and for a moment, something sharp and lucid flashed in them. "Another one," she whispered. "He found another one." "Now, Catherine," Will chided. "Anne is family. She's here to help you get better." "Better?" Catherine's laugh was hollow. "Like Helen got better?" Will's perfect mask slipped for just a moment. "That's enough. Nurse, perhaps Catherine needs her evening medication early." "No!" Catherine's voice strengthened. "No more pills. No more treatments. No more perfect wives." She lurched from the chair with surprising speed, grabbing Anne's wrist. The tracking bracelet beeped in protest. "Get out!" Catherine hissed, her fingers digging into Anne's skin. "Get out before—" The nurse moved quickly, producing a syringe. Within moments, Catherine was slumping back into her chair, her warning dying on her lips. "I think that's enough excitement for one evening." Will's mask was back in place. "Anne, darling, you should rest before tomorrow's fundraiser." But Anne barely heard him. Her eyes were fixed on Catherine's hand, which had pressed something into her palm during the struggle, a small piece of paper now burning against her skin. Back in the mansion, Anne waited until she was alone in the bathroom to read it. The handwriting was shaky, but clear. Basement, files, truth about first wife. First wife. Anne's mind raced. The files in room 317 had shown others before Catherine, but nothing about a first Mrs. Harrington. She had no time to dwell on it. The fundraiser was beginning. Guests already arriving for the preliminary cocktail hour. Anne could hear their voices drifting up from the grand ballroom as she dressed. "You look perfect." Will appeared in the doorway, appreciative. "Shall we greet our guests?" The ballroom was transformed, glittering with crystal and candlelight. 200 of New York's elite mingled, sipping champagne and admiring the decorations. None of them knew they were standing in a prison. Mrs. Harrington, an elderly woman, Anne recognized from the hospital board, approached. "Such a lovely event. Though I was so sorry to hear about poor Helen Harrison. Such a tragedy." "Yes," Anne managed, feeling Will's hand tighten on her waist. "She will be missed." As they moved through the crowd, Anne's mind worked furiously. The basement. She needed to get to the basement, but with Will watching her every move, with the tracking bracelet monitoring her location. Then she saw it, her opportunity. Lucy was serving champagne, her hands still shaking slightly. Their eyes met across the room, and Anne saw the same desperate determination she felt. "Darling," Anne turned to Will, playing her role perfectly. "Shouldn't we check on the kitchen? The timing of the courses is so important." Will's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Of course. Though perhaps Mrs. Reynolds—" No, I should do it myself. Everything must be perfect." Anne touched his arm, letting him see the submission he expected. "You should stay with the guests. The senator was asking about the hospital expansion." A calculated risk. Will's ego versus his suspicion. After a moment, he nodded. "Don't be too long, darling." Anne moved toward the kitchen, but the moment Will turned away, she caught Lucy's eye and gave a slight nod. Seconds later, there was a crash of breaking glass. Lucy had accidentally dropped an entire tray of champagne glasses. The distraction was perfect. As Will and the other guests turned toward the commotion, Anne slipped through a service door and into the maze of corridors that led to the basement. The tracking bracelet beeped in protest as she descended the stairs, its signal weakening. She had minutes, maybe less, before Will noticed her absence. The basement was vast, a warren of storage rooms and utility spaces. But Anne wasn't looking for those. She was looking for something hidden, something protected. Behind a wine rack she found it, another keypad-locked door. Her fingers flew over the keys, inputting the same code from room 317. The lock clicked. Open. Inside was a small room, its walls lined with old files. These weren't the clinical records from upstairs. These were personal, photographs, letters, newspaper clippings, and there, in a file labeled simply Rebecca, she found it. The truth about Will's first wife, the real first Mrs. Harrington, the one who had started it all, the one who had died. Rebecca Harrington hadn't disappeared. She hadn't been committed. She hadn't been treated. She had died. Anne's hands shook as she read the old newspaper clipping. 20 years ago, Will's first wife had fallen from the mansion's east wing balcony, a tragic accident according to the official report. But the hidden file told a different story. Rebecca had been a researcher at Evergreen Heights. She'd discovered irregularities in the hospital's experimental treatment program, and then she'd discovered something else, her husband's involvement. The sound of footsteps above made Anne freeze. Her time was running out. She quickly photographed the documents with her burner phone, tucking it back into its hiding place in her elaborate updo. The tracking bracelet suddenly beeped to life. Signal restored, which meant, "Found something interesting, darling." Will stood in the doorway, his perfect smile now twisted with malice. Behind him, Mrs. Reynolds and 2 security guards blocked any escape. "Rebecca," Anne said, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "she wasn't just your first wife. She was your first mistake." Rebecca was brilliant, Will stepped into the room, but she didn't understand the importance of the work we were doing, the potential. She was going to expose everything. "So you killed her." "She fell." Will's voice hardened. "A tragic accident, but it taught me something valuable. Brilliant women make terrible wives. They ask too many questions. They need help to become perfect. Like Catherine, like Helen. Helen was a failure. She forgot her place." Will moved closer. "But you, Anne, you were supposed to be different. You were supposed to be perfect." "Perfect?" Anne laughed, and there was something of Catherine's hollow tone in it. "I'm a journalist, Will. I never stopped investigating. I just got better at hiding it." His hand shot out, grabbing her throat. "And now you'll need treatment, intensive treatment. Such a shame, having 2 unstable wives in the family. The guests upstairs might notice. They'll understand. After all, the signs of your instability have been there for weeks. The paranoid accusations, the delusional behavior. Poor Mrs. Harrison's death, affecting you so deeply." His fingers tightened. "By the time I'm done, you won't even remember this conversation." "You're right." Anne managed to smile despite his grip. "I probably won't remember this. But they will." She pulled out her phone, not the burner but her official one, the one she knew was monitored, the one that had been live-streaming their entire conversation to the guests upstairs. Will's face contorted with rage, just as shouts erupted from above, the sound of running feet, police sirens in the distance. I learned from the best." Anne's smile was razor-sharp. "Everything had to be perfect, remember? The live stream, the backup evidence on my burner phone, the police chief among the fundraiser guests, even this confrontation. In the one room your security cameras don't cover, so you couldn't control the narrative. The door burst open. Police officers flooded in, weapons drawn. Behind them came the police chief, looking far less jovial than he had during cocktail hour. "William Harrington III." The chief's voice was grim. "You're under arrest for the murder of Rebecca Harrington, the false imprisonment of Catherine Weber, and conspiracy to commit medical fraud." As the officers moved to handcuff him, Will maintained his perfect posture. Only his eyes betrayed his fury as he stared at Anne. "You'll never be free of me," he hissed. "You're mine, my perfect wife." Anne removed the tracking bracelet, letting it fall to the floor. "No, Will, I'm a journalist, and you just gave me one hell of a story." The next hours passed in a blur of statements and revelations. Catherine, finally free from the cottage, provided testimony that corroborated everything in room 317's files. The hospital board members, horrified by the evidence, exposed decades of medical abuse. Lucy and other staff members, no longer afraid, came forward with their own stories, and in the mansion's grand ballroom, where New York's elite had gathered, for a simple charity fundraiser, the perfect facade of the Harrington legacy shattered beyond repair. Weeks later, Anne stood in front of the mansion one last time. The property would be sold, the proceeds going to a fund for Will's victims. Catherine was in a real treatment facility, slowly recovering. The hospital's experimental program was under federal investigation. Helen's death remained officially an accident, but Anne had included the truth about her in the exposé she'd written. The story had blown open similar cases across the country, other powerful men, other perfect wives, other golden cages. As she turned to leave, Anne caught her reflection in a window. The woman who looked back at her wasn't perfect. Her hair was windblown, her clothes chosen for comfort rather than appearance. Her smile, when it came, was real. She touched the window briefly, a farewell to the person she'd pretended to be. Then she walked away, leaving the perfect Mrs. Harrington behind forever. In her pocket, her phone buzzed with a message from her editor. Follow-up story? More cases. And coming to light? Anne smiled. She had more work to do, more truths to uncover, more cages to break open. After all, she was a journalist. And the story wasn't over yet. The end. That was a beautiful story, wasn't it? I hope you enjoyed it. Please, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your collaboration is very important to me.